Good morning, everybody. I'll just give people a moment to come in online. Today we have the Q1 2026 national and international accounts for you. I'll take you through the national accounts and my colleague Gillian Roach will take you through the international accounts. We'll take questions at the end. If you want to pop them into the chat during the meeting to help me prepare, that'd be great too. All the material will be on cso.ie along with the contact details for each of the publications. The main message, I guess, we have for you here today is a big fall in GDP, over 12%. So the new information that we have on that mainly relates to all our quarterly returns we just got in over the last number of weeks. And that's the difference over what we had in a monthly estimate we produced 30 days ago. The big factor here that's affecting GDP is the unwinding of the growth we saw last year in the pharmaceutical sector. So it's the globalization element to that rather than the cross-border element that you would have seen in monthly data. So it's the globalization adjustments to the cross-border trade that give us this fall in industry or GDP in the quarter. So we'll explain that in the next couple of slides. But you'll also see that the other side, the domestic driven side of the economy, has small positive growth. So they're the two stories we're going to try and explain to you today in the slides. Our infographic here shows you the output method on the top and the expenditure method on the bottom. That fall in GDP, you can see, is straight away is driven by the industry data there in the first bubble along the top. The other big M&E sector, the ICT sector, is down 2%, but then a big domestic sector, distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants, that's up 0.2% along with a small increase in construction. The expenditure side to the data, you can see it on the bottom. So personal consumption of goods and services, that's up at 0.6%. Government expenditures up 0.5%. The investment data there is down slightly, but you'll see this in a little bit of time. We'll see the slides on the modified investments actually up. So that run of domestic data is all showing small positive increases, and we'll try and explain that to you during the seminar. If we look at the apologies, I'll just get back to that. It's going in the wrong direction for me. Let's try the other way. Can somebody move it back for me today? No. Okay. Okay, thank you. There we go, that's where I wanted to get to. So looking at two sides of the economy, there's the GDP number in the blue bar and the domestic side, modified domestic demand and the green bar. So what we're looking at today, that big fall in GDP, is that unwinding of that activity we saw at the end of 2024 and mostly in 2025. So those large increases there. We've seen that data kind of fall off a little bit over the last couple of quarters, and particularly now in Q1 2026. We'll also watch out for any kind of timing issues we see between Q1 and Q2 26. So as usual, we'll hold our fire on the year 26 until we see more data and see what happens there. But we can also just strip away that M&E activity and just look at the domestic side. And with the domestic activity, we can see quarter on quarter of positive growth. There's quite a positive story there, even when we compare the data internationally of domestic growth. 30 days ago, we produced a experimental or a frontier release on GDP, and that only had a small fall of 2% in the data. So that came from our monthly surveys, and we only have one method underlying that, the output method. Since then, we've continued engagement of our large case unit with big firms. We have all their quarterly data in with a lot of detail, and we get a chance to interact with the big firms, not to check the data and ask them what's going on. And that gives us that new information around the globalization aspect of the data. And that's given us that fall of 12% in GDP. If we look at those M&E sectors, a small fall in the ICT sector. So over time, over many years, we're seeing continued growth in the ICT sector. There's a small fall there this quarter in the ICT sector. But it's that industry sector in green, which is largely driven in the last 24 months by pharmaceutical data. We just publish industry in the publication today, but it's a fall off in that data in Q1 that's driven the results. And we can look at our sectors in terms of M&E and domestic. So foreign dominated sectors and domestic dominated sectors, so these are activity sectors in the economy. It looks pretty much like the GDP and MDD graph we saw a couple of slides ago. Those domestic sectors, again, to focus on the largest one, I guess, by weight is distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants. We're seeing growth in that, a little growth in construction, along with professional admin and support services. So a broad-based set of domestic growth, small positive domestic growth. And at this point, we also like to keep an eye on the wage bill, how much people are being paid in the economy. And we have really good, almost real-time data on this. And this is falling a little, right, -3%. The main factor driving down the wage bill, which looks different from a lot of the other domestic data, it's hours worked have fallen. So in Q1 2026, we'll see from our labour force survey publication that hours worked has fallen across a number of sectors. And that's what's driving down what we call compensation of employees or wages. That's the only one that's kind of bucking the trend in the run of domestic indicators. On the expenditure side of the accounts, so we get the expenditure measure of GDP by adding up consumption, government spending, investment and net exports to get the blue line at the top. And we strip away the net exports to come up with domestic demand. So we modify investment too. So to build up from the bottom on that, you've our consumption of goods and services, government spending, and then modified investment. And that gives us our MDD result, or modified domestic demand result, of plus 0.6% for the quarter. And if we look at contributions to that across time, we can see that it's consumption this quarter that's keeping the MDD growth rate up. It's the main factor keeping the growth rate up in Q1 2026. Looking at each of the items on the expenditure side, we've continued growth. So despite the large price increases you see in the economy, we're still seeing large increases in consumption by all of us on goods and services again this quarter. Right in the middle there. The European measure is called household final consumption expenditure. That's roughly equivalent to what we call PCE, or consumption in the Irish data. And we're in the middle of the pack as such when we compare ourselves to available European peers. The next item that contributes to the expenditure side, government data. So in money terms, that's down a little bit quarter on quarter, but we take price effects out and then we look for trends in the data, so we seasonally adjust it. And so after that, we see that government expenditure is up, so it's above trend, 0.5% above trend in the quarter. The investment data is a little hard to interpret because of intangibles, but when we adjust for intangibles and aircraft, we get modified investment, and we can look at some of the figures that drive investment. The formal term in national accounts is capital formation. This is investment data. So it's down 0.8%, but when we adjust for the globalisation elements around IP and aircraft, and the bottom there you see the modified investment is 0.8%. It's up by 0.8%. The big story probably there is, well, we're seeing positive growth in building and construction. That's on both sides of the accounts, a small positive there. But the big story is probably around machinery and equipment falling into Q1. So our computer hardware numbers are down in Q1. And that's related to really quite large data center investment we had in Q4. So the base effects of a large Q4 giving us a fall into Q1 2026. And that's suppressing, I guess, the overall modified investment numbers for Q1. If we then look at the last element in the expenditure side, net exports or trade, Gillian will give you a lot more details on this and the product detail on it. But for us, it's that, I guess, green line in the middle of it there, that falling net exports over the last couple of quarters, which has had the GDP effect for us, in particular the GDP effect today. To get the transition then from GDP down to the net measure product, and we bring in the net factor flows. So what's important, I guess, to look at here today is you've really quite low profit outflows of 17.6 billion quarter on quarter. That's in constant prices, seasonally adjusted. So that relates to the fall in industry. So we see a fall in output in industry and then a fall in their profits going out. So it leaves GNP largely unchanged. It's up 1.5%, but that's the equivalent to the fall in the production. We also see a fall in profits. And then before I finish, it's worth dwelling a little bit on prices. So when we have our consumer price index now running at 3.7% in the year to April, and we're all very conscious of that, it's important to remember that all the national accounts numbers are with prices stripped out. We've got a lot of effort to look at data when it goes up in money terms, to take the price effect out, and to look at the volume terms, or how much actual things are we consuming of goods and services, not just the price of them. And a good example there is on the right-hand side. So the year-to-date consumption numbers are up 5.4%, but there's a price effect in there of 2.8%. So we present data to you at a 2.6%. Okay, so we're taking the price effects out to just look at the productive element, or the volume, the amount of things, extra things we're consuming of goods and services. And the same principle applies on the left-hand side to GDP. The M&E prices are quite different than the domestic consumption prices, so we have a smaller deflator there. But the principle remains the same, that we really have to look at prices at the moment when we're looking at our macroeconomic measures between one period and the next. Just to summarise for me, the news today, I guess, is we have that fall in GDP, down just over 12%, driven by the fall in industry. But the domestic sectors are showing a small positive 0.4% there. On the expenditure side, we can see a run of those domestic items. Consumption, personal consumption expenditure up 0.6%, government expenditure up 0.5%, modified investment up 0.8%, and the overall measure on that side, modified domestic demand, with all the deglobalisation work done, gives us a result of 0.6%. So I'll hand over now to Gillian to take you through the international accounts.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll start with our infographic, which gives us a summary of the results of the international accounts for this quarter. So we have goods exports there of 77 billion, with imports of 46 billion, giving us a merchandise balance of 30.6 billion. On the services side, we have exports of 127 billion, imports of 117 billion, so that gives us and it's positive services balance of just under 10 billion. And then on the income inflows, we have inflows of 81 billion, outflows of 104 billion, giving us net income outflows of 23.1 billion. And those three items then combine together to give us our current account balance of 17.4 billion, or 12.5% of GDP. At the end of March, the net international investment positions, that's the balance between our financial assets and liabilities with the rest of the world, stood at a net liability position of 340 billion, and the stock of foreign direct investment in Ireland stood at 1.1 trillion euros. So then, looking at that current account balance as a percentage of GDP, we can see the trend there over time, fairly stable in recent quarters. But then, looking more at the elements of that, we see an increase of 11.6 billion from this time last year, so 5.8 billion in Q1 2025 to the current level of 17.4 billion. And compared to last quarter, that balance is up by 4.6 billion. Now, as was reflected in the earlier slides, the merchandise surplus has decreased significantly from this time last year. So 74.2 billion in Q1 25, down to 30.6 billion now, and that's driven. That high level last year was driven by those very high level of goods exports. So we're seeing a decrease of 43.6 billion year on year, and compared to last quarter, we can see that declining trend through the year, and the merchandise balance compared to Q4 25 is down by 11.6 billion. Looking on services, that's the green bar, we have an increase in net services of 10.3 billion compared to last year, and compared to last quarter, that balance is up by 1.8 billion. And the net income inflows have declined, so you can see that kind of mirroring of the merchandise balance there, from 68 billion this time last year to 23.1 billion this quarter. So that's a decrease of 44.9 billion compared to last year. And compared to last quarter, that's a decrease of 14.4 billion. So looking then in more detail at the goods imports and exports, we see that the components of that decline in exports, and we have a combination of both decreased exports and increased imports, and the two of them taken together then gives us that decline in the net merchandise balance. So then if we look at the different components, we see that the year on year, that decline in the exports is driven by the international trade. So the Navy bar has gone from that very high level in Q1 down to its current level for Q1 26. And then the quarter-on-quarter change, however, is driven more by decreases in merchanting and goods for processing, which are down 9.4 billion and 5.5 billion respectively. Looking at our services exports, we see they're up overall in the year by 11.5 billion, and that's largely driven by increases in computer service exports, which are up by 9.3 billion, while business services exports showed a slight decrease of 0.3 billion. And just to note as well, the tourism services exports were up by 252 million, while transport services are down by 11 million. Looking then at our services imports, year on year, we have an overall increase of 1.2 billion. We have a decrease of 8.9 billion in the business service imports, and again, that's in line with the decrease in goods exports. These services support that activity, but that's balanced by increases in royalties and increases in imports in other services, up 5.4 billion and 3.4 billion respectively. And then looking at those royalties in more detail, so we can see the blue line gives us that the overall royalties, and that's broken down into pharma there in green, and the other category in yellow, which is mostly dominated by the ICT sector. So the pharma royalties, we can see they're up, royalty imports are up 0.6 billion compared to last year, but down 0.7 billion in the quarter. And while the total royalty imports have increased by 5.4 billion year on year and decreased 4.6 billion compared to the last quarter. So that year on year increase is driven largely by the ICT sector. The decrease in the quarter is driven by both pharma and ICT. So then looking at the quarterly profit outflows, again, we're seeing that downward trend over the year in the manufacturing sector there in green. So that's down 16.1 billion on last quarter, whereas the information and communication sector, the yellow bar, is up by 297 million on the last quarter. And over the year, we see that the manufacturing sector outflows are down by 36.4 billion, while the ICT sector is down by 1.2 billion. Just to briefly then look at the net IAP, we've already noted that stood at minus 340 billion at the end of March, so that's a decrease of 36 billion on the end of December 2025, and that decrease is largely driven by changes in the non-financial corporation sector. And just then to look at the multinational activity of foreign controlled corporations there in the IFP, so we've got that broken down into foreign and domestic controlled. So we see that the foreign-owned net IFP stood at a net liability position of 523 billion at the end of March, while the Irish-owned IFP had a net asset position of 183 billion. So they're the foreign-owned in navy and the Irish-owned in green, and there's more detail on this and further breakdowns available in the publication. So just to finish up there then, we'll have a quick look at the current account with the US, which covers those same categories of merchandise, services and income. So we can see that we have the deficit has grown by 39.2 billion compared to the last quarter, but is down by 6.4. Compared to last year, but is down by 6.4 billion compared to Q4 25. So that brings the current account deficit to the US currently to 64 billion euros. And within that, we can see the decrease in the merchandise balance, the navy bar, down by 42.8 billion year on year, and 9.3 billion quarter on quarter to its current level of 7.9 billion. On the services side, where we have a net deficit, that deficit has decreased by 1.4 billion year on year to 51.1 billion, a decrease of 3.7 billion on last quarter. And the net income outflows have decreased by 2.2 billion compared with this time last year, and by 12 billion compared to the last quarter. So the combination of all of these, of the positive merchandise balance with the negative services balance and income, gives us that overall deficit of 64 billion. So just to summarise then, we have the overall current account balance in Q1 26 of 17.4 billion, or 12.5% of GDP. We see that strong downward trend in the merchandise exports compared to last year and the last quarter. On the services export side, we see increased computer service exports in the year, and we see the net income outflows also on a downward trend, mirroring the exports trend. So I'll hand you back to Chris to summarise.
Thanks, Jane.
Oh, sorry, we both clicked.
I'm just trying to go back up. I'm not even going to try to go back.
There you go.
Anyway, thank you very much. So I'll summarise, I guess, on the range of indicators that we have for you today. The big one, I guess, the big story is around that fall in GDP of just over 12%. And that's driven by the M&E sectors. You see that 2/3 of the way down there, fall in the M&E dominated sectors that's driving that. When we look just under that, the domestic sectors are showing a 0.4% increase. We see modified investment have a small positive increase of 0.8%. Consumption of goods and services up 0.6%, and all those combined give us that modified domestic demand, or summary to globalisation, a measure of 0.6%. So I'll open the floor up to questions. There's a couple online already have to come in. I'll take it to the floor first if anybody wants to start off.